Good afternoon, everyone. We'll try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. There we are. It's my pleasure to welcome you. My name is Earl Lewis, and I have the great honor of serving as the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor of History, African American and African Studies and Public Policy, as well as I'm the founder and director of the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan. And in partnership with my colleague, Nancy Cantor, who is the Chancellor of Rutgers University, Newark, we bring to you today a conversation that is part of our ongoing effort called Our Compelling Interest, which is both a book series and a public dialogue series dealing with critical questions related to diversity and democracy in American life. This series and its origins go actually back to 2012. There was convening at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in New York City. It was after the Grutter and Gratz decision a few years later, and we thought it was important to bring together academic leaders, lawyers, general counsels, and others who were interested in the question of opportunity, race, diversity in American life. And when Nancy and I were sitting there, I was then president-elect of the Mellon Foundation. We were amazed, I guess is the word we would use, by the shallow depth of knowledge of some of the key members, particularly of the higher education community, general counsels, presidents, and chancellors, about the issues around opportunity in American life. And Nancy and I have been involved, and particularly Nancy, in crafting the overall social and legal strategy that the University of Michigan deployed, leading to the Grutter and Gratz decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was not that many years later when we're sitting there going, how few people actually had paid attention to the research and the lessons that we actually tried to share with the broader community so that we could all go forward together and do so successfully. So coming out of that meeting in December of 2012, we decided that perhaps we should do something. And then when I became president of the Mellon Foundation, it was easier to do something because I have money and other kind of resources. And so as part of that, we began what we call the Our Compelling Interest series, starting with an initial book that was really a framing book to talk about the value of diversity and democracy, about how to define diversity, how to leverage diversity, and then how to value diversity for the benefit of a healthy and vibrant democracy. That book was then followed by a second book by Scott Page, and that began to deal with other kind of questions where he referred to the diversity bonus and to look at organizations and institutions and what they gain by actually having a diverse set of actors weighing in on complex problems. The third book in that series was then by Eboo Patel, who talked about religious pluralism and the ways in which Islam is actually a part of the American story going back to the 17th and 18th centuries, and not just a story about what happened after 9/11. And that as we move forward and think through then this pluralism, we need to begin to sort of talk again about then this democratic promise that involves bringing all peoples to the table. And now we are here with a more recent book by Gary Orfield, The Walls Around Opportunity. And this book begins to really talk about what it means to have invested so much as a society in the notion of colorblindness and what that has done or not done in terms of affecting equity and opportunity in American life. And so these books have been part also then of public engagements. And so this is the first one for the most recent entry. But we've had meetings at the National Press Club and the New York Public Library, at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Art Institute in Chicago. I mean, one of my favorites was actually before a live studio audience in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, after the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue, where we talked about religious pluralism and what that meant. And so what we're trying to do is not only raise these questions, but bring them to communities to engage. And so today, we hope you will join us in engaging in a conversation with the panelists as they begin to explore the questions presented by Gary, and we think about what this all means. Ms. Chang here will be the moderator, and Mitch will introduce the panelists and who is the Vice Chancellor here for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Associate Vice Chancellor, sorry. I just promoted him. That's not a bad thing. I'll put in a plug later. Associate Vice Chancellor and also a professor here at the university will moderate this session. It will be about 45 to 50 minutes among the panelists, and then we will open it up to all of you here. And we invite you and your questions, and I think we also have cue cards available, so you can write questions down as you are sitting and pass them to the end of the aisle, and we'll collect them and curate them and try to address your interests and perspectives, et cetera. And then my colleague Nancy Cantor will close, and then we will conclude with a reception this afternoon. But we're delighted to be at UCLA. Thank you, Gary, both for the book and for the environment, and let's get started.
You don't have to show this right now. We'll get to that. But thank you, Earl, and thank you all for being here. Welcome. And also welcome to the folks who are not here with us physically, but I understand are Zooming in or using the internet to join us. And maybe we'll have a chance for them to also raise questions. Anyway, it is my pleasure to serve as today's moderator, and I was also promised a couple of minutes to provide a few short opening remarks about Gary's important book. Like much of Gary's scholarship, this book hits home for me, both professionally and personally. On the professional side, I have examined the relationship between education and racial diversity and joined Gary, I think it's almost 25 years ago when he was still at Harvard, to protect race-conscious admissions practices. The walls around opportunity continues to make the case that race-conscious policies do indeed work, but they are consistently undermined by policies based on race-blind ideology, stalling efforts toward advancing equity and inclusion. Even worse, as Gary argues, the assault on race consciousness has rolled back some of those early keystone civil rights efforts and policies. Now here's where it hits home for me personally. I arrived in the US from Taiwan in January of 1971, about 7 years after Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. As we all know, the act did not change our nation overnight, and additional federal interventions were needed. In 1968, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which enabled my parents to purchase a tract home in a new development in San Jose, California. Now, growing up, I did not realize that this development was actually quite extraordinary, as it was the first, among other firsts, communities that had been built from the ground up under civil rights protection. Now we could get to the picture. So here's the picture of my 4th grade class. The racial composition here was similar to those who resided on my home street, Vista Park Drive. Our next door neighbors on one side was an African-American family named the Presleys. On the other side of us was a German-American family, a second-generation German-American family called the Hildebrands. Next to them were the Kongs, a third-generation Chinese family, and a couple of doors down from them were the Alvarezes, a Mexican-American family. Now, growing up in an integrated neighborhood prepared me for a future that I thought would certainly materialize, namely that racial integration would accelerate as I moved through life, especially as the demographics of our country continue to shift. The walls around opportunity tells us that my expectations were somewhat naive, because instead, racial segregation in many parts of our country accelerated beginning in the 80s, which led to dire consequences. While we celebrate your achievement, Gary, I have to say that you are not the bearer of good news. However, you spent nearly half the book sharing recommendations about what we can do to reverse those negative trends. As I read the second half, a song kept coming to mind. I grew up listening to Olivia Newton-John. Any Olivia Newton-John fans here? May have been the only one. Anyway, since she passed, I began rotating a few of her songs on my playlist. Her song that kept coming to mind is titled "The River's Too Wide." It comes to mind because the river metaphor has been used famously by Derek Bach and the late William Bowen, affiliated with the Mellon Foundation, in their book about access to elite higher education. Now, since I can't sing, can I get the next slide, please? I'm going to read the words to you instead. A main verse goes something like this: "The river's too wide now for crossing. The water rushed too loud for talking. We never build bridges for walking. There's no getting to the other side. The river's too wide now for crossing. The current goes too deep for mending. It looks like an unhappy ending because the river's too wide." I certainly hope we can avoid an unhappy ending, and our panelists is here to share their thoughts with us. But before introducing our distinguished panelists, I want to bring Gary up here to say a few words to help get us started. So, Gary. And of course, Gary doesn't need any introduction, I'm guessing, so we'll just have him get started.
Well, it's great to be here with you guys today and to see physical books going into human hands and hopefully knowledge expanding and people being motivated to think through these issues at still another level. Anybody who's written a book knows how many stages there are to anything like this and how many people help. And I want to express appreciation to everyone who contributed to it and whose work was cited in it. As you'll see, many, many scholars were. This book is a reaction to a crisis in educational and civil rights equity in our country. We have been going backwards in important ways on civil rights ever since the 1980s. And we are now with the most hostile Supreme Court in at least a century, facing the real possibility that we will lose affirmative action in higher education in the coming session of the court. It will be argued, interestingly enough, on Halloween. And for many of us, it's one of those you don't need to dress up in scary costumes to think about that day. We're fiddling on the edge of a social crisis. We are going through a historic demographic change without a plan. And we are throwing away a lot of the tools that we invented in an earlier time that were designed to make it work out better. We have gone from a society that in the civil rights era where 80% of the young people were white to a society where less than half are. We've gone from a society that had 5% Latinos to a society that has almost 30% Latinos without any real plan about immigration policy or equity policy, and it's been developed during that transition. We're now, in important ways, a four-race society, profoundly unequal. This book is about the idea that as we think about abandoning the final tools that we have, affirmative action is the last of the major color-conscious policies that hasn't already been dismantled by our conservative Supreme Courts since the Clarence Thomas appointment consolidated a really hostile majority back in 1991. We're going through a demographic change of tremendous inequality. We are the most unequal society in the Western, among advanced nations in the Western world in terms of economic inequality. Our economic inequality is directly related to racial inequality, which is based on a system of residential and school segregation and is perpetuated through that system, which has not been effectively addressed. We had conditions, the only period in American history, this book argues, that we ever successfully and seriously addressed these issues was the Civil Rights era, in which we did a number of things. We expanded the spaces to college. We took action against the 17 states that had a history of separate colleges for black students. We greatly expanded, well, we created the first major federal aid for higher education and expanded that. We had the anti-poverty program. We did school desegregation in a serious way, the only time we've ever done it. And we created affordable higher education that was genuinely accessible and had a financial aid system that at its peak paid 79% of the costs of going to a four-year public college. In other words, we really made college accessible. And towards the end of the 1970s, we had virtually equal racial access to some kind of college for the first time in American history. By the early 1980s, we lost that, and we began to reverse all these policies. We made college much more expensive because we cut state taxes and we cut state funding of elementary and secondary higher education, and we decided to shift the cost to the students. Since that time, we've had an increase of college costs that has tremendously outrun the increase of wealth and income in the society. So we've had almost a 20 times increase in nominal costs of tuition for a four-year college on average. We've had about a seven times increase in nominal income. So college costs have increased about 3 times as fast as income has increased. We've tried to make up that gap not by increasing the Pell Grant to cover those costs. We failed. It's gone down to funding about 30% of college costs. We've tried to do it through loans and rinky-dink arrangements of every imaginable sort that have left our students indebted, and many of our students out of college altogether, and many others choosing what college they go to on the basis of how much they can afford. So the idea of this book is twofold. One of them is the only period in which we made real gains was when we decided to focus explicitly on race, hold people accountable for it, sanction discrimination, and provide the resources necessary to make the change happen. During that period, we made huge changes that lasted a long time until they were intentionally dismantled. Since that time, we've dismantled all of those major positive trends that we created in the middle 1960s and early 70s. We have lost all of the increase of integration of our schools for the last 50 years. We've abolished almost all serious desegregation efforts. Our students of color are concentrated in inferior schools with less experienced teachers, more limited curriculum, much less prepared peer groups, and much narrower curricula. It's no surprise they're not ready for college. When we ignore that reality and we think that everybody's been given a fair chance and we think that we can just look at merit, and merit is directly related to opportunity, we're going to just legitimate a system of racial inequality and perpetuate it, because higher education does perpetuate inequality. The premium for higher education in Southern California has gone from about 29% a generation ago to over 120% now. So this access to college and success in college and type of college is defining and perpetuating the system of inequality. We can't change it, the book argues, without deciding to change it. We can't change it since almost everything in our society in terms of opportunity is linked to race, explicitly considering race and holding people accountable, as we did in the Civil Rights era. If we want to really change it, we don't just have to preserve affirmative action. That's already been lost in 9 states under California's leadership. And it only affects the most elite colleges. We have to think about race in general and design policies that deal with the reality of race, not the pretense that everybody has equality and opportunity in our society, and hold people accountable for it. When we did that, we made big changes. When we stopped doing it, we allowed a steady drift into deepening inequality. And this book is at a time when we are losing some of the last tools we have, is saying we have to insist on much more far-reaching tools. So it's directly countercultural in this time. But if you want to think about ways in which a society like ours becomes viable, these are the kinds of things you have to think about, the kinds of things we have to figure out how to create a politics to create and to sustain. And leaders of higher education, of course, are part of that politics. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you, Gary. And I understand we have a video. And go ahead.
This book, The Walls Around Opportunity, The Failure of Colorblind Policy in Higher Education, is a message to higher education and to public schools that we're on the wrong path, that it's not working, that it's neglected the basic reality of our society, which is racial difference, racial exclusion. The colleges are a precious resource in terms of offering opportunity to people of color and offering opportunity for everybody to be trained to be leaders in our major institutions across racial and ethnic lines. We can't do this without explicitly thinking and acting on racial inequality. That if we try to do it in some indirect way, it won't work, because the root of the problem is in the racial inequality that hits people of color from even before they're born.
You look back at the policy of the 1960s and when Johnson declared his war on poverty, the cost of public education was mostly met by the Pell Grant. But in the late 70s and early 80s, increasingly states began to pull back their support for public higher education. In many states, we ended up spending more money per capita on incarceration than on education. And you kept thinking, okay, how did our priorities shift?
Look at higher education and say, are we doing the expansive talent search? Are we looking at the assets of students, or only thinking of their deficits and how we could maybe help them? Let's not help them, let's actually empower them and bring them to the table. In reversing the really deleterious effects of these decades of colorblind policies, we have to think about what race-sensitive and race-conscious policies look like. How will they really function on the ground in educational settings? But we have to do that not in a vacuum. We have to do that taking into account the lives and neighborhoods and histories that students actually come from.
The history of discrimination goes between generations. If your parents were denied an education, they don't have the resources to send you to college. They don't have the resources to get into a neighborhood with good schools. They don't have the knowledge of how you connect with college that people whose parents have been to college have. That's a direct intergenerational effect. It passes from one generation to the next, especially within the context of residential and educational segregation.
In addition to our retreat from a conversation about diversity, there's really a broader retreat from an encounter with history. We want to walk away from the past because it may make us uncomfortable. But if you can't talk about the history of the United States in K through 12, and you realize only a fraction of Americans actually go on to higher education, when will all the citizens of our country understand our past? Because failing to understand it means then we can't account for the present, let alone begin to design a future. And so if you start with the premise, as we have in this series, that talent is equally distributed across the world, access to opportunity is not. We come back to then the importance of defining, leveraging, and valuing diversity for a prosperous democracy.
What more important lever for that valuing diversity and leveraging diversity is there than education? Without educational opportunity, the systems that have excluded will win out. And the only way we're going to get educational opportunity is to take down the walls around opportunity.
what's happened is the country's changed racially. Our civil rights policies have retreated and been reversed and attacked and assailed, and they're now under tremendous threat in the United States Supreme Court, which is the most conservative Supreme Court we've had in more than 90 years.
And as Gary's book really pinpoints, the segregation in our schools by race and class is really undermining the ability of everybody to live together in a multiracial democracy.
And what we're trying to end up really suggesting to a broader set of publics is that this is a we, not just an I, framing of the question of diversity.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, now we're going to get to our discussion with the panelists. And before we do that, let me introduce our distinguished panelists here, starting with Audrey Dow. Audrey is a Senior Vice President for the Campaign for College Opportunity. Mayra, Lara, sitting next to her, is Associate Director of Educator Engagement for the Education Trust. And Alison Yoshimoto-Towery. She's my new colleague at UCLA and is serving as Executive Director of the UC-CSU California Collaborative for Neurodiversity and Learning. What a mouthful. And about, what, 2 months ago, or was it more than that? 2 months ago, you served as a Chief Academic Officer at LAUSD. So we're delighted to have you all. Unfortunately, Stella Flores, my good friend at University of Texas, can't join us because of health reasons. We miss you, Stella, but we'll move on regardless. And as Earl mentioned, we're going to do this have a panel discussion. I'll moderate it for about 40 or so minutes, and hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes, we should leave a couple of minutes for questions. I understand that there will be cards where you can write your questions down, and then we want to bring up Chancellor Nancy Cantor, who is the Chancellor of Rutgers University and also Professor of Psychology, to say a few words. So we look forward to that as well. So to get us started, I'll just throw out a question, maybe for you, Alison, to get the UCLA connection going here. So I was wondering, given what you've read and what you've heard from Gary today, and what you see as some of your takeaways, what resonates with you from where you sit, and also based on your long history working with the schools?
Sure. Thank you. This is an amazing opportunity, and I use that word opportunity very deliberately because it came up a number of times already today. And one of the things, particularly my former role as Chief Academic Officer of an urban public school system, a large one, is that diversity is in every seat. You can walk into a school, into a classroom, and it's bubbling with diversity and sparky, bubbly, lit eyes of students with tremendous energy. And somewhere along the way, and as we read Gary's book, we lose that spark in our students. And I think that just coming in today, I had an opportunity to talk to Professor Frankie, who's here at UCLA, and just about the opportunity that we have starting from a very young age, from preschool, particularly in California with the expansion of early transitional kindergarten in the coming years, and really reimagining a new role for universities in some ways to have these partnerships with K-12 that, I'll say birth to 12, that really provide that sense of belonging to students, that culture of expectation, that college is a place for them, and also for our families, particularly in our ecosystem. You know, we support 2 and 3 generations of families who also need to learn to navigate the system and understand that it's an opportunity that is afforded to all, but how to get there is one thing. So I'll start with that.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Lara, what about you?
Yeah, same. I have the privilege of visiting school districts across the state of California and really get to see the diverse set of students across our state, Southern California, the Central Valley, and Northern California, and really think about the opportunities that are present or not available to students based on where they live, geographically located, who their teachers are, who their counselors are. Right? I get to see that some students do receive a lot of support from the adult on campus because they are surrounded by adults who believe in them, who believe in their success. And then there are others who don't have those opportunities because there are adults in their school buildings who have preconceived notions about what students are capable of doing based on their zip code, based on their English language designation, based on race and ethnicity. And those doors to opportunities are regularly closed to these young people to no fault of their own. And they're not even given the opportunity to show that they are in fact capable and intelligent and willing, and it is possible for them to thrive in school buildings and in the education landscape if only they were given the opportunity to do so, if only they were trusted, if only they were seen as fully capable beings regardless of their age, regardless of their zip code, right? And so that is something as both now in my role at Trust West with having the privilege of visiting schools across the state, but also in my previous role as a high school English teacher in LA and being able to see what a difference it makes, right, for young people to have adults who create space for them to be fully themselves and who recognize their brilliance just because they exist is absolutely beautiful.
Thank you. And Ms. Dow, just to continue that line of thinking, how does your organization focusing on college opportunity account for some of what Dr. Lara pointed out?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, and thank you again for the invitation to be here. I think like all of you, we believe in the transformative power of higher education and the idea of a college education as a great equalizer. My grandfather crossed the border on foot from Mexico, raised his family as a baker, as a panadero in East Los Angeles. My father went to high school in East LA, as I did, went on and went to community college for 2 years, Los Angeles Trade Tech, and earned a certificate there. And that certificate changed the trajectory of the entire Diaz family. Just 2 short years got him an apprenticeship that then became a journey, where he became a journeyman and got into the steel industry and led to a life of really economic security, right, that all of our families are struggling for, a retirement, steady health benefits, the ability to maybe go on vacation to Vegas or San Diego, nothing crazy. But that is, that California dream, that American dream that our students today, our communities, the reasons why people still come to this country for that opportunity. And in so many ways outlined in Gary's book, we continue to deny generations of people that opportunity to grow and to thrive. I think it's an embarrassment that California has a ban on affirmative action, as progressive as we proclaim to be. That said, I think that there are some progressive policies that the Campaign for College Opportunity has championed, because we can indeed, with data and statistics, prove disparate impact. There are real practices. There are real hiring practices, admissions practices, progression practices in our colleges and universities that are intentionally keeping out Latinx and Black students, Southeast Asian students, Hmong students, Native American students. And those are the ways that I think we have to think now, thinking, with the affirmative action case looming in the background. That is the way that we have to think moving forward about our racial equity efforts. How do we continue as a community to elevate disparate impact and acknowledge that we are violating students and people's basic human rights by continuing to use a broken remedial education system, by continuing to use standardized tests to determine merit, to determine talent. So those are some of the things I want to talk about.
Yeah, so Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of words about California. California has the most segregated schools in the United States for Latino students. The absolute epicenter is here in Los Angeles and in the Inland Empire. There is no place that is worse. And it's not just segregation by race, it's segregation by race and poverty. The typical Black and Latino student in California is in a school that's more than 2/3 poor. The typical white or Asian students in a predominantly middle-class school, and they are 20 times as likely to be in a top quintile school in terms of math and English scores as Blacks and Latinos. Most Blacks are inside of Latino schools, and they are extremely disadvantaged. We've done a recent projection that says that if you look 30 years into the future for the country, there will be no net increase in the share of Blacks finishing college unless we change the trajectory that we're on right now. So we're talking about really serious structural issues in which this state has really done nothing about the explicitly racial dimensions of them for decades.
Thank you. So continuing that thought too, so Ms. Dow, you seem to hint that when it comes to affirmative action, if the courts rule against this policy or this practice, you seem to think that there will be broader effects beyond those at elite institutions that are using. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think what we saw in California when voters voted in favor of Proposition 209 to end affirmative action, the consideration of race in hiring and contracting and university admissions, we saw a statewide chilling effect on racial equity efforts. And that is a huge concern that we have. What we've learned in California over the last 20 years is that colorblind policy doesn't work. The University of California, we're sitting at UCLA in one of the most diverse cities in the country, and UCLA's demographics do not match at all the city of Los Angeles, the county of Los Angeles demographics, despite efforts that the UC system has put in place to try to get at equity. So I think there's a real concern that there will be an overinterpretation of the Supreme Court decision that really chills all equity efforts, not just affirmative action. And I think that's where we have to really elevate our voices and beat the drum around disparate impact to say there are students who are being disadvantaged, and we do have to change policy, we do have to change practice while we have lost one tool. One of the things we continue to say in California is that affirmative action did have a chilling effect for students being admitted to the UC system, and we haven't recovered from that. But we didn't use affirmative action, and we don't in the California State University system, and we don't use it in the California community colleges. There's 2 million students in the California community college system compared to 200,000 at the UC system. The vast majority of students of color are in our open access institutions here in California. So how do we, when we're talking about equity, and that's across the country, how do we think about interventions that better serve students at the community college level? Because we have a critical mass of individuals in those systems that will make up the future and current workforce of our country. This isn't a conversation I think that we're having that's a moral conversation. I think there is a morality to it for sure, personally, but this is an economic imperative for California and for the nation. The reality is the demographics are changing. We have a knowledge-based economy, and if we do not have the workforce, the people who will maintain our tax base, who will be the innovators, we're going to suffer. We're going to have a more stratified communities and all the negative things that come with that.
Thank you. Dr. Lara, you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think there are implications, right, on the K-12 system as well when we're thinking about the fact that in California we're living within the confines of Prop 209. We know that the governor, for example, has been unwilling to consider bills that may conflict with Prop 209, such as currently it was AB 2774, which would have modified supplemental funding for school districts so that students in the lowest performing subgroups could have additional funding, right? And so because of the confines of Prop 209, the governor was unwilling to hear AB 2774. And it's important to remember that we target government funding for other racial and ethnic groups using proxies for race, but when it comes to Black students in the state, constitutional challenges really do become an issue. And so as a result, we are failing Black students in K-12 systems, Black families, Black communities, and we continue to do so, right, because of the confines of Prop 209. So to Audrey's point, we really have to consider, what does it look like in practice? What can we do within school buildings, right, to work around the confines? What can we do strategically? I was remembering, both just from a personal, on the personal side, as I was reading the book, I'm an immigrant. I'm a formerly undocumented student. I attended my entire K-12 schooling as an undocumented person. And then I remember as a teacher, when we were having conversations about better supporting our undocumented students, some adults in the building were saying, well, if only students would let us know that they were undocumented, then we could better support them. And I had to say how to request that our young people put themselves in danger so that you as an adult can think about, can even fathom how to better support the young people in your school building is absolutely ridiculous and criminal, really. I shouldn't have to be a formerly undocumented person to know how dangerous it is to have to disclose my status to anyone in any government building, especially the school building where I see folks every single day. So to ask of our students to have to disclose who they are and what their lived realities are in order to transform practices is unacceptable, right? So we really have to consider and investigate what is happening in the school buildings and how we can transform adult practices to better serve our young people. Again, considering that we're working within the confines of Prop 209 in California.
Yeah, thank you. And the term intervention came up a couple of times, so I want to ask you, Alison, and Gary pointed this out in his book, that more and stronger partnerships between K-12 education and higher education are needed. So what kinds of partnerships do you think will yield the highest returns for improving opportunity?
I'm so glad you asked that question. A lot of our opportunity does lie in partnerships, and I'll name a couple. One, the LA College Promise, Los Angeles College Promise, preceded the state Senate Bill 19 in California called the California Community College Promise, which affords students 2 years of free community college. That particular partnership with K-12 has resonated, and actually, even though we've seen a dip in enrollment due to the pandemic, has actually resulted in higher, not only fall to spring completion, 30-unit, 60-unit completion, but also 43% increase in degree completion at the community college level in Los Angeles. And so I think that is an example of something that when students are afforded the support, the opportunity, the mentorship, the belief in them that you can do this and we're here to support you, they will persevere and get their degree and then transfer. Another is right here at UCLA, which I would encourage other universities across the country to think deeply about these kinds of partnerships where students have, it's a partnership with the K-12 public education system, specifically to support students of color in getting into college. And actually the graduation rate of students in the UCLA collaborative have a very high degree of graduation rate, higher than their peers. And it just proves that by going to overnight stays at a campus, getting an opportunity to talk to college counselors, I've had students come up to me and say, "Miss, I didn't think I was college material," or "I didn't know that I could be on a college campus and be successful." So those kinds of agreements, also memorandum of understandings with the colleges for dual enrollment is really important, and having ways of K-12 public education to measure the number of students that have opportunities to complete either a dual or concurrent enrollment course also proves to students in high school that you can be successful in college while you're at that. And I'll just say I'm working with a district right now that they're developing a College 101 dual enrollment course, and in high school, students will learn to get what a brag sheet is, they'll learn what a letter of reference is, they'll learn about the importance of having extracurricular activities and being involved in the public sector. They will learn how to write their personal statement in a high school course while getting concurrent enrollment credit. And so those are the kinds of opportunities that we want high school students to have, not post senior year. We want them to have them while they're in high school so that they know come fall of their senior year they have those opportunities. So those are just a few examples.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
I was just going to talk a little bit about how important it is to investigate practices when we're talking about equity and getting at college opportunity. And for a second, I want to talk about the LA College Promise, which is amazing, and that it does give students 2 years of free community college. But if we investigate that program a little further with a racial equity lens, in order for a student to participate, they have to commit to going to school full time. That is not something that the majority of our students of color can do. You've all seen the studies. UCLA's done them, CSU. Students are struggling every day to have a roof over their head, to eat, we're figuring out in California, how do we get every student who's trying to enroll in college onto CalFresh so they can afford basic food. The idea of students going to school full-time will absolutely work for students, no question about that. But the reality of who can take advantage of that is the racial equity imperative that we have to be thinking about. I'm a proud member of the California Student Aid Commission, and I think California does one of the better jobs across the country in financial aid. And one of the things that this governor did last year was to remove a barrier that we had really elevated to his office for community college students to access aid. In California, you're entitled to a Cal Grant, which covers pretty much all of your tuition at a CSU or UC if you meet certain income criteria. If you are a year or more out of high school, however, you are no longer entitled to that program. Well, guess what? If during a COVID year, if you did not go to school because you had to work, you had a family member who lost their job, you couldn't travel, just any year, think about all the reasons why low-income students of color would not enroll in college right after high school. You're totally low income, but now you're not entitled to aid. That is not an equity-minded policy. We had about 300,000 eligible students in California for that aid, with only 30,000 awards. Imagine that. And we know affordability is one of the driving factors of whether or not a student enrolls in college. So the governor, with the legislature, rolled back that regulation, and we saw a huge influx of new students, predominantly Latino and Black, who were able now to access that entitlement award. But again, those are the types of things that we have to be diligent about, looking at these policies, having people in the room, like all of us, that understand the nuances of our communities and what we struggle with as we design these policies, and really try to work around the fact that we cannot be explicit about race.
Thank you. Dr. Lara?
Yeah, and if I could add about how powerful of a tool dual enrollment partnerships could be, right, between K-12 and community college settings. But again, without the explicit investigation about who is given access to dual enrollment opportunities, right? What courses are offered to students? Because one of the things that we see is that those students who are deemed college bound are often the ones who are told about, informed about dual enrollment opportunities, who are supported to both enroll, to access resources, to understand the power of dual enrollment for both college affordability, for persistence, right? And are we back? I think we're back. And so it's really important to not just set these programs to create these partnerships, but to also investigate it. And then to develop goals. If we're noticing that it's a specific group of students who are continuously given access to college opportunity programs, then do something about that. Right? Then set goals for Latinx students, set goals for Native American students, set goals for Black students. Look at what your institution looks like, right? Whether it's a K-12 school, community college district, or community college school, what does the student population look like there? And then who is given access to these opportunities? And then who is supported to actually succeed with these opportunities, right? And then based on those data, develop goals to ensure that equity is in fact at the forefront of these decisions, of these practices, because without that, then we're going to continue to replicate some of the existing inequities that have existed and persisted for students of color and low-income students across the nation.
Gary, you want to add to that?
That you see is that we have a lot of choice in California, and it's expanding all over the country in terms of charters, in terms of magnets, and so forth. If you have choice without equity, the most informed people get the best choices. It always happens. It's happened all over the world. We know how to run choice with equity. That was done during the civil rights era. You have to have explicit policies and plans and outreach and support systems and so forth. Otherwise, you maximize inequality. When I was supervising San Francisco schools for a federal court years ago, we created supplemental education programs in the afternoon, evenings, and weekends in the middle of the largest Black community in San Francisco. And they were actually received mostly by Asian students from other parts of the city because of all the barriers that Black students and families face. So unless you think about this and you do policies that are designed with sensitivity to the realities of the families' lives and communities, you can do something that sounds really good, and it can actually increase inequality. We did another book called The Educational Delusions about this, the University of California Press published, about ways in which choice increases inequality if it's not connected to equity.
Alison, did you want to add to that?
I just wanted to highlight what my colleagues have mentioned around the data piece. The importance of having immediate and disaggregated data is crucial when looking at implementation at any level, really. And I think there are tools that exist that can tell us by student group, whether it's by race or by language or by other ways of disaggregating gender, the course intensity that students have access to in high school, and it's preparing them for a college trajectory. Those aren't generally tools that I've seen in every district. Those are tools that somebody in leadership needs to go after to get and procure. But those are the kinds of things that should be a staple in every district, including some of the reports that are available when it comes to college access. You have to take extra steps to get disaggregated reports. It's not part of the basic package. And then I wanted to also highlight just this idea that the roles of universities also in preparing future teachers is also important. And I just wanted to highlight that today because teacher diversity is something I know many K-12 districts struggle with and continue to want to achieve. But it's sort of this what comes first in the conversation. But as we look at college admissions, we also have to be thoughtful about, at the end of the day, the role of people's lived experiences in K-12 education, who's supporting our students of color, and does our teacher population have not only racial, but also just lived experience, which could be economical, could be cultural, could be language, related connections and rapport with our families, like you said, people who really believe in our young people, and that will open the doors for them, and see not only deficits that can be very hard to ignore when you look at just pure data, disaggregated data, but really focus on the assets that our students bring and the assets that live in our communities.
Yeah, you all seem to point out that good partnerships and interventions require a lot of hard work in the front end. But instead, we often hear more about the politically popular moves, like, for example, President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan. So, Gary, I know you have some thoughts about this. We often hear in the media about the good of this plan, but there must be a bad or ugly side to it. Are there?
Well, it's a good thing, but it's not the priority that I think those of us who are concerned about college access would probably choose, because it does not affect access to college. It really is about debt, and it's about a particular kind of debt. Students who've been to college can get debt forgiven. Students who can't pay the rent can't get debt forgiven. I mean, young families who have other kinds of debt don't get anything forgiven. And none of it affects future generations of students, which is what we really need. I was one of the people who did a memo for the transition committee, and my priority was doubling the Pell Grant immediately. And President Biden promised to do that. That would be a $6,500 increase in the maximum Pell Grant. Guess what he got this year from Congress? $400. So at the same time, we're doing a huge expenditure about cutting debt, which I certainly am sympathetic with. I have kids who've been to college and had debt, and I've got grandkids who are going to be going not too long into the future. But a lot of students can't go at all. And the Pell Grant does not work. We don't have financial aid policies that are adequate to make four-year public colleges available. Community colleges is not equal to going to a four-year college. We find here in California, very few students from high poverty high schools successfully transfer out of community colleges. It's a very low percentage. People who go to four-year colleges who are poor in California graduate at a high level. Think about where we would put the money, what absolute priority should be to make it possible for poor kids to go to college. So we shouldn't just do one thing, but certainly we have to do that. If we don't do that, we're just allocating college opportunity on the basis of income and wealth, and wealth is incredibly unequally distributed. And then we are saying the people who get college degree deserve to have successful lives, and people who don't. It's a very rigid stratification system. If we don't make any path that actually can work, the society will be badly damaged.
Other thoughts?
I think that in California, and that's where the Campaign for College Opportunity, sits in the higher education space, we are operating on a higher education system design that is from the 1960s. We still reference our master plan for higher education, which is, a brilliant plan that a lot of people talk about, and it was a plan designed to say where people would go, right? You have the top 10, 12% go over here to our research institution. You have this middle, sector that serves 30% of your students, and that's your workforce, and then everybody else, for whatever they need, 70% of folks are, going to go to the California community colleges. And that worked in the 1960s for the population that we had, for the economy that we had. And I talked to the campaign was actually founded by a couple of baby boomers who, I self-identify as white, Jewish, amazing leaders who benefited from that master plan and got a free, public education, as did many of their peers. They went on to be provosts at Stanford and faculty at Berkeley. and we're amazing, amazing men. But once, you know, the demographics of the state started to change, there was a fundamental breakdown in that promise at a time when the economy is actually demanding a more highly educated worker. Does it make sense in California that we still send 70% of all of our students into a community college where their likelihood of completion is around 30%? Versus the UC, where it's closer to 70 or 80%? I mean, how can we say as a state that we want to remain economically competitive and we're okay with really hindering opportunity to our tremendous research institutions? And so I think there needs to be this reimagining of what higher education is for and who it serves. I think we've gotten comfortable with the US News and World Report ratings, and people love those. You know, it's kind of like, who's qualified? That is the culture. Who's qualified to come in versus who can we serve? Who can we help? Who needs us? What does the state need from us? What does the country need from us? And think about admissions that way.
Let me provide a space for others to jump in if you like.
I've just been sitting with this notion of the purpose, right, of higher ed, and to Alison's point earlier about when we're thinking about who the educators are in our space and the role of higher ed in preparing our educators. And again, at Trust West, we sit within the California context. And returning to this idea of data and lack of data, we can't even answer, because we don't have that publicly available data about who our teachers are in terms of race, ethnicity, languages, et cetera, right, where diversity is really important. We don't know who's in our teacher preparation programs, because we don't have available those data across all of the CSUs. We don't have those data available across all of the UCs. We know based on qualitative data, for example, why educators of color leave the profession. They are often not supported to succeed. They are often given additional tasks outside of their professional roles to be translators or disciplinarians, et cetera, right? And so in the absence of data, in the absence of being able to answer some really critical questions about this partnership between higher ed and K-12, then what do we do? And we know that K-12, for example, on the K-12 side, they do collect these data and they do report them to the state, but then the state doesn't make them available, right? And so asking these questions about, like Audrey mentioned, who and what is higher education for? Who and what is the teaching workforce for? How are these partnerships working? Can we know who is in the profession, who is leaving, who is being prepared? What are the goals that we need to set in order to meet the needs of students across the state, whether they are in preschool or in higher ed institutions?
Thank you. Alison?
Just again, to build on my colleagues, I think a lot of what we've said too, for me, highlights the need for research practice partnerships across the system and across the ecosystem, because typically, having been a classroom teacher and a school principal, we're not research experts. We're practitioners in doing the work daily, you know, in teaching and learning and managing schools. But for the larger ecosystem to support some of the policy work or some of the work that needs to occur really does take that ecosystem partnership. So I would just encourage real thought to be put into these opportunities that our PPs have in helping to not only establish goals, establish metrics, but to identify progress where it's being made and how to replicate and scale those pieces.
Thank you. Audrey, let me give you a chance to expand on that before we move to audience questions.
I will share that, at the Campaign for College Opportunity, we produce a series of reports called the State of Higher Education in California. We do these every 2 years on the state of Latinx in California, on the state of Blacks in California, and on the states of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders. And I will tell you, we look at everything from college preparation all the way through to completion and a number of metrics in between, and how policies are serving or not serving students. And getting that data is incredibly difficult to get. And, when these reports come out, there's a tremendous response nationally to what we've learned and what we've found. But a lot of that data comes from Public Records Act. That is not the way we should be operating within our institutions of public higher education, that we have to submit public record requests to get data to tell us what's going on. We're in the middle of a debate right now with the Cal State University system, and maybe some of you saw this in the news recently, that they have a huge graduation initiative working to increase graduation, working to close equity gaps, but there is an insistence on lumping together, aggregating up all students of color into a URM bracket. And what does that mask? It masks the fact that Black students are not being admitted, are not enrolling, and are not completing at the same rates as their peers. But when you aggregate Black students with Latino students, with Asian students, it pulls up the grad rates, and it appears as if we're done with our equity work, and we are nowhere near that. And the fact that that's a debate at our California State University system, that there's a reluctance to disaggregate that publicly, that a newspaper had to break that we had to break that, is just unconscionable. And I think questions my thinking on whether or not we really do have a commitment to equity here in California. We also produced a report called Left Out a few years ago, and we'll be redoing it next year. And that looks at the racial, ethnic diversity of faculty, adjunct faculty, executive cabinets, and academic senates across the state of California, by college, by system, also the governing boards of our systems. And I have to tell you, in California, 70% of our student body is racially, ethnically diverse. The faculty, when you look at any of those categories, except for governing board members, 70% white, the majority male. When you think about gatekeepers of why we don't have policy and practice that is more equity focused, well, who is driving decisions on those campuses? It is not people who look like the student body at the university. It is not people who look like and have the lived experiences of the students coming through our K-12 systems. That's a huge mismatch and a reason why we're here.
Point well taken, and certainly being thoughtful about data and how we carve it up is very, very important. And I appreciate what Gary did in his book by disaggregating Asian Americans from his statistics. At the same time, I think we got to be also very careful here how we do this, especially to not encourage considering Asians as adjacent whites. Alison, have you thought about this at all in a district like LAUSD where you have a diverse range of Asian Americans?
Definitely, and I understand why Gary made the decision he did in the book. I do think I have a kind of personal statement that's every student by name and need an asset. And I think that there's always danger in grouping students, and putting students in sort of in a stereotypical group. We have a great deal of range of Asian American students, and I think that not all students fall into the same category. So I think it is incumbent upon us at the system level to be able to have that data. I fill out, my kids ask me, what am I? Because they're mixed, biracial, and what am I? And I always have to decide, well, what box do I check? And there are some systems that are now asking for, give you 200 choices, and you can choose, more specifically how you identify yourself. And I think that that's an important piece for our systems to begin to understand, is that needs have to be taken at face value, not just given, students shouldn't be just given a label. And there are definitely, whether we're talking about race or again, even by learning disability or by gender, other kinds of ways of box checking, that it's important that we attend to the actual student and the needs of that actual student in front of us, and personalized instruction and supports for that child.
Interesting, one of the questions, we anticipated one of the questions just now about Asians. Any Asian Americans? Anyone want to comment on that? Yes, Dr. Lara?
Alison, your comment reminds me that I had the privilege of visiting a school district, different high schools within a school district in LA County a few years ago. And they, a leader, took it upon themselves to build a data system, an in-house data system, and they really tapped into the teachers at their school site who are data whizzes and loved numbers and loved working with data, because they already capture those data, right? They collect those data about students. And so they were able to answer questions about, for example, how are their Cambodian students doing in the school district? And they could even narrow it down even more. In 9th grade English, how are Cambodian girls doing at the semester, at the 6-week mark, right, et cetera, et cetera. They were able to answer those questions because of an in-house data system, and that really took a leader to say, this is a necessity for us, because if we just aggregate all students, then we can't answer these really critical questions, and then we can't provide supports on an individualized level to what students actually need to thrive, right? But it shouldn't take that. It shouldn't just be one leader in one school district at one school site to say, let's build an in-house data system, right? So that the student who is lucky enough to go to that school in that school district gets the supports that they need in order to thrive and succeed, right? It shouldn't be the case that that is what we're doing.
Terrific. Okay. Gary?
We have a lot of data that looks at Asian students in this book, and it's true, of course, as I've had so many Asian students who want to write about the model minority myth, about the fact that there are disadvantaged Asian populations. Absolutely true. The more data that we get, the better off we are. There are also very disadvantaged white populations, which are almost completely ignored. If you look at Northern California, for example, or parts of the Inland Empire, you have a very disadvantaged white population. We have to look at all these populations in depth. It's part of what universities can do. And we should insist on getting data, and we should insist on getting it out into the world where it can do some good. Now, Asian students as a category are by far the most successful educational population in the country. Asian adults have by far the highest educational levels and income levels. That's a reality. That's not a statistical trick. But there are sub-communities. I grew up in Minneapolis. We have a big Hmong population. It's very disadvantaged in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We have to pay attention to that, obviously. How we think about these categories is we can't just sort out here, but it's worth thinking hard about, and it's worth digging deep, and it is worth looking at. San Francisco has been collecting data on 8 or 10 categories. We are going to need to do things like that in the future. Another thing to point out in the book is that nobody pays any attention to the Native American populations, which are extremely disadvantaged. The data that we've been able to find shows that their situation is very much like black students. And they have fallen badly behind in the affirmative action, loss of affirmative action in California. Since their numbers are small, they're ignored. And people just leave them out of their data. They are a population that if anyone has an Aboriginal right in this country, that population is being almost completely ignored in the high policy discussions.
Well taken. And to make it even more complicated, these categories are constantly evolving and changing. So having a sense of what's happening at the ground level is important here. We have some really interesting questions here, and I'd like to get to at least one of them before bringing up Chancellor Cantor. And so I'm just going to pick this one, and then we'll see how much more time we have. this person asks, is integration the top priority, or should we prioritize investing in and supporting what might be considered segregated minority schools and neighborhoods? Would that reinforce segregation, or you know, what are there thoughts on this? I think that's kind of what this question is hinting at. How do you deal with schools like that and not encourage segregation, maybe? I'm not sure, but any thoughts on a question like this?
This is a question, I've been involved in so many school desegregation issues. This is the first question that always comes up. And the answer is you have to do both. And most people who oppose integration also oppose funding. We did a survey of all the colleges and admissions offices in the country with the American Council on Education, and we found that the colleges that practice affirmative action also practice positive affirmative policies for poverty. The colleges that don't practice affirmative action don't practice the affirmative poverty programs either. So it appears that you do both or you do neither. And I think that that's what the basic breakdown is. And people who oppose one of these policies always tell you you have to choose. You don't have to choose. You have to do both to have a rational response. And our basic strategy in the country has been to give money to the segregated poverty schools. That's Title I. We put hundreds of billions of dollars into that. We haven't had any money from the federal government for integration since Ronald Reagan. Since 1981, it was basically the school desegregation funding for voluntary integration was shut down. We haven't gotten it back in the last 40 years. So people think we're spending a lot of money on integration, and we're not. We spent a lot of money transferring funds to impoverished schools, and of course that's what the low-income, that's what the basic California formula is about. The problem is schools are students and teachers. We have the least qualified teachers in those schools. Even though we've given them a lot of additional money, we have not gotten the teachers to go there and stay there. We haven't diversified our teaching force. We have teachers who don't want to be in those schools and leave as soon as they get enough seniority. We have union contracts that enables that to happen. We have a whole system that cancels out the effect of putting additional resources into those schools. We have to think about this in a much more complicated level, and we do have to do both. We have lots of good schools. There are schools you can walk to from this room that are very good public schools for a very rich community, and they are doing nothing to get opportunities for low-income African American and Latino students to have those opportunities. We have to think about both of these things in every way we can.
Thank you. Other comments? I'm sure you see these examples. So how do you go about doing this? Or do you have any comments on that among the panelists?
Also, it's just reiterating the importance of implementation, right? The idea of integrating schools without being thoughtful about what the ecosystem is going to look like is problematic. I've had conversations with school leaders who just want to integrate schools, and they want to do that within the next academic year. It's like, well, okay, well, what is that going to look like? Who are your educators? What are the support systems? How is the student population going to change? How are you setting up the ecosystem to ensure that not only students are supported, but their families as well? This is a shock, right? When we take students from one institution to the next, right? It does something to young people, and it's important to be thoughtful about how we're implementing policies to ensure that they are going to be supported, and we're not just placing students in a new environment, and we're not just telling families that their students need to be in new environments or different environments, albeit that there would be better schools, right, based on resources, but how are those resources are allocated to really support the young people who are entering those new buildings is important. So again, just being really thoughtful about implementation.
Thank you for raising implementation. I have a tangential, personal, but I think important experience, and that is that I'm 5'4", but I was the center on my basketball team growing up. And that's because after World War II, there was a whole creation of Asian American basketball leagues because Asian people weren't allowed to play in regular basketball leagues. So those still exist today. And I bring that up to say, like, I don't think I'd had that opportunity to ever play center or forward on just a regular basketball team, you know? And so it's also about the opportunity that, integration or not, the opportunity that students are afforded for leadership, for, to be put in positions of where they're pushed, to no matter what, you know, the environment is around them. And I have friends that have gone to segregated schools that have were very successful because they were pushed at a high rate, regardless of their environment. And then the opposite, where the kids have gone, my friends have gone to integrated schools, and they felt like they were living in a school within a school, and they didn't have the same opportunities. And so it comes back to, for me, fundamentally that experience that every student is afforded, and are they given every single opportunity and open doors, you know, or do we open doors as systems for our students in that way?
Audrey, any last words before we bring up Chancellor Cantor?
I would just say that there are the ripple effects of K-12, you know, being segregated on higher education, and where a student lives really does dictate where they go to college. There are a lot of policies, especially at the UC, to try to give local students an advantage to be even on this campus, but they just, I think, are not working. They're not working the way that we've intended them to work, and so I would just say we've got to keep at it.
Thank you, and please join me in thanking our panelists for their thoughts. And now I bring you Chancellor Cantor.
This is made for tall people. So thank you all so much. Amazing panel, and so important to focus on the specifics. That's what I really take away from this. Focus on the specifics, but do it boldly, because we have to reverse what's going to come down the pike now. So, first of all, let me begin by thanking not only this amazing panel, let's do another round. And Mitch, thank you so much. But also the Mellon Foundation, Princeton University Press, the Civil Rights Project here at UCLA, and Lori Russman. Where's Lori? Where? Big round of applause back there. And absolutely the team at the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan, Doreen Tinajero, back there, big. You know, one of the things one would take away from this is we have to do it together. It takes all these people. It takes all these insights. You know, Scott Page's diversity bonus was all about who's at the table. What are the insights? What are the lived experiences, as Alison said? We have to take that into account. So let me go to a high level now and scare us all for a minute. We've had 40 or so years as a society where prosperity is increasingly carved off for only a few, where policies that purport to be colorblind in reality promote a racial dividing line between the haves and have-nots, between those who can access successfully the full educational pathway that you're all talking about, the K to community college, to four-year institution, on to prosperous careers and intergenerational social capital and wealth. And Gary's book outlines this absolutely critically. Segregated schools, and I'll get back to that, inadequate preparatory curriculum and college counseling, critical, the kinds of social capital networks that are made, discriminatory disciplinary policies. He talks about that, and I think that is just so important. In my home city of Newark, New Jersey, we see that everywhere, in the school system. And then inadequate and not sufficiently race-sensitive financial aid policies that absolutely fail to take account of the actual circumstances of families that we know make such a difference. So as Gary says in the book, education's become a sorting machine. Imagine education as a sorting machine. And we need to dismantle that with both race-conscious and race-sensitive policies and practices. We cannot realize the benefits of diversity. And Stella is not here, but I urge you to look at her commentary because she talks about how we maintain systems of opportunity hoarding, of exclusion, and artificially colorblind measures of merit. And doing that, we can't solve a racial problem in a non-racial way. That's the bottom line. But how are we going to get there? What are we going to do collectively? This will increasingly put our society in peril, as Earl and Mitch and the panelists have said, as in the book is said. Look at Bill Fry's diversity explosion. He writes about that in the first book in our series. It's marching forward. Look at the statistics that Gary gave us about the demographic changes. If we fail to leverage the talent of this next diverse generation, and let me quote Stella here from her commentary in the book, the move forward is not to deny color, language, and culture, but instead for colleges and universities, and I here would add K-12 schools, to take into account these factors as assets for a multiracial and globally competitive nation. And one of the things I loved in this panel was the weaving of assets. Assets, assets, assets. And as a college and university chancellor, I will tell you, it is really hard to get that across. And one of the reasons that I would argue that integration absolutely has to be on the table is we have to convince a lot of white people in power that there are assets out there. We need diverse representation at the table to really bring those lived experiences to bear. But we need the people in power to understand that we're all in one place together. And if we don't fight for integration, we will not get that. We simply won't get that. I live in a very liberal state. You live in a very liberal state. I live in New Jersey, in case you didn't know. New Jersey, as Gary's data has shown in other forms, has one of the most segregated school systems in the country, even though it is one of the most diverse states in the country. And we have a constitutional commitment in New Jersey to equal education opportunity. So we and others in New Jersey, in Latino Action Network et al. Versus State of New Jersey et al., are suing the state over school segregation. Not because we think integration is the only answer, as Gary outlines in the book, but because if we don't go back as a country to all feeling that we are in it together, I urge you to go back and read, it's mind-boggling, the 1968 Kerner Commission report. Everyone, and I quote, everyone does better when everyone does better. Their prognostication that we were heading towards, and I quote, two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, proved pretty darn right. And even more so now, when we think of our incredibly rich, talented, diverse next generation. But as Elise Body, our civil rights legal scholar and collaborator of mine and Gary's and other people, has said, and I quote, Segregation by race and class is a load-bearing wall for inequality. Look at those walls around opportunity. It produces deep unfairness in our educational system. Segregation also erodes our democracy, and that's what I want to go back to. She says, by breeding distrust of people who are different, lessons that people often carry into adulthood. And that's why we cannot leave that on the table. Now, I take, and Earl takes, and others who worked on our cases at the Michigan cases, I take a particular view, of course, of the fact that this court is going to overturn the many, many, many pieces of data we put in place to argue that the educational benefits of diversity are not to be ignored. But this court will do that at a moment when Black, Latino, and Indigenous talent is consistently pushed off the pathways to educational success. And if they do it at this moment, it will not just affect the elite institutions, those institutions that care about U.S. News and World Report. Sorry, I don't, but many people do. It will not just affect those institutions. It will affect the inclusive public institutions like I lead. It will affect LA Unified School District. It will affect those schools and families throughout, because when they overturn affirmative action, they will make a statement that colorblind is okay, is preferable. And that will be a ripple effect, not only throughout higher education, because I can assure you there are university general counsels all over this country right now examining the use of language about race in all our policies. I cannot tell you how many times I have argued this. And that will be true in K-12. So the disaggregation of data that you were all talking about, which is so important, that principle in the school you described will not be able to do it if people turn to colorblind policies. It will ripple out. And I say this not just to be dramatic, but really to argue that we all have a collective responsibility, because we know what that ripple effect will be like. It will crush the dreams that have been put into place. We won't be able to even be race sensitive, no less race conscious, unless we all push back. But if we all push back, when Earl and I were putting together those lawsuits for Michigan, every lawyer we brought in the room said, don't, you're going to lose. We found one that supported us, but every lawyer said that. Well, we won that case. Now it's going to be gone, and it was only a case about affirmative action. But other things will follow. For example, the Fifth Circuit's going to overturn DACA. That is equally, if not more important, in the ripple effect that it will have. So I urge that we leave this room both emboldened by listening to the ways in which an asset framework taken seriously can in fact make a difference. And there are policies we can do, but also a little scared and a little threatened. And the way in which being scared and threatened should embolden us to make a difference. Because democracy and a prosperous society is at stake. Thank you all.
I understand we have a reception, probably very close by here. So thank you for joining us this afternoon, and please join us at the reception.